It was quite a few years ago that my mother cleared out the loft. It was before the Conservative government removed the subsidy for substantially improving the thermal insulation laid between and above the joists forming the ceilings to the bedrooms. The stored objects, formerly hidden away from view, mostly went in the bin, but she handed me a bag, telling me that it was my father's reading system. The bag contained several newspaper clippings, children's early reading books, pages of carbon copy letters sent by my father, and replies received, together with pages of notes and proposals for the publication of a pamphlet. His system was an idea that he had applied in teaching his children to read before we went to school just before 1960. To start with, I flicked through the reading books. I had no memory of them, and I was today mostly impressed by the sheer energy of Janet and John, forever running around with their antics charmingly represented by simple watercolours. Then I began putting the correspondence in chronological order. This gave me a comprehension of his efforts to share his ideas, even before I had begun to analyse the reading system. I was astonished to find that the first letter in the correspondence was a carbon copy letter to the Minister of Education in September 1960. My father was then 40 years old. He was shunted by the Ministry of Education to the London School of Education, who, after months, shunted him back to the Ministry. Then, in November 1961, the Daily Express published an article describing an educational experiment to which he felt obliged to react. The article was titled Progress Report on the Augmented Roman Alphabet, and in brackets, a primer for puzzled parents. This experiment for reading instruction created a 43-letter alphabet, adding entirely new symbols to the existing 26-letter alphabet. Behind it was the observation that there are 43 sounds in the English language. This fact is what my father used too, but what got him annoyed was the creation of new symbols with no relationship to normal English. Perhaps he was obsessive about correct spelling, but he could see where this new system would lead, and in retrospect, he was exactly right. He tried and tried to get others to see that such an approach would lead children into a wild forest as far as spelling is concerned, from which they may never emerge. Children were expected to magically revert to standard English 2 years or so after having learned something almost completely abstract. He wrote to the Surrey County Council, the body responsible for local education, but all they suggested was that my father approach a publisher. This was April 1962. I was 4 years old. In July 1962, the Sunday Times published an article, a kind of work-in-progress update, about the augmented Roman alphabet experiment. My father once again responded with a published letter the following week. He repeated how the system led inevitably to misspelling, pointing out that 14 of the 55 words used in the sample text within the article were incorrectly spelled. Sir James Pittman, MP, responsible for promoting the experiment, responded to my father in the letters column, citing a particular shortcoming of my father's approach, but essentially remaining open to the potential benefits it could bring. It is ironic that the one example of complexity that Pittman gave in criticism of my father's system was not addressed by his own system either. The essential quality of the Maurice Ayley approach is that it simultaneously teaches reading and correct spelling. When he wrote directly to Pittman, elucidating this, the MP was really only interested to the extent that he could add my father's method to his grandfather's library. In January 1963, frustrated by the intended 5-year trial of the Pittman system, Maurice approached the publisher, Oliver and Boyd, proposing the printing of a 20-page pamphlet explaining his system to teachers and parents. He went to this publisher because he found their Happy Venture Readers series extremely good for reading instruction. They were not at all interested, but they were, to quote, "most grateful to you for thinking of us." The next approach, 2 months later, was via a personal contact at Heinemann Educational Books. The material sent was returned, but Maurice persisted, taking time off work to go to Mayfair. The result was the same. They did not think it was worth publishing, until there had been some form of organised research. March 1964 brought another disappointment. The Pitman Augmented Roman Alphabet experiment had changed its name. It was henceforth the Initial Teaching Alphabet, and had obtained funding via Parliament. Sir Edward Boyle, the Minister of Education, had battered away my father's letter, saying that he was impartial in recommending one system or another. Yet when it came to the Pitman experiment, proposed by a fellow Tory MP, funding became available. The last letter in the chronological file is a letter from February 1965 to the BBC. There must have been exchanges on the radio about the inefficiencies of the initial teaching alphabet. By then, I was nearly 7 years old, my brother 8, and my sister nearly 10. You might say that his work was done, even if his system could have helped many generations of children. He died 18 months later. This video is the first time since then that his method has been presented. Maurice James Ayley was not a linguist, nor was he in education. He worked in administration for the Ministry of Agriculture, Fisheries and Food. This ministry had been relocalised to Colwyn Bay during the war and then moved to Surrey in the mid-50s, bringing many employees from the north, including him and my mother. He did have a natural pleasure in mathematics, and no doubt this aptitude for applied scrutiny was helpful in establishing his reading system. The most important concept we need to assimilate to understand the approach of his work is that text is no more than shapes on paper that represent sounds that we have heard. I am not a linguist either, nor work in education, and in order to describe the work of my father, I have had to do more research than I thought would be necessary to be able to put it in context. For a native of a language, I think it is taken for granted that speech precedes reading, and then reading facilitates writing. Without having heard and repeated sounds, without sounds having a familiarity, it is very difficult to latch those sounds onto text, shapes that represent those sounds. A child's early acoustic environment is therefore very important in making the steps to understanding what texts are all about. To this idea that texts are shapes on paper representing sounds, you have to add the abiding respect that my father had in spelling being what it is. It was this respect for correct spelling that motivated him with his method and made him criticise the Pitman system. Spelling in all countries is a mishmash of historical accidents. It is said that modern English is 40% French. Perhaps French is 40% Latin. Nobody would conceive any language as they are today if they sat down and designed one. Just to show you the reality of language, here are examples of how treacherous English can be. These 7 words are not, as you may first think, part of my father's reading system, though there have been people who advocate that English be recreated something like this. In fact, I have taken these words, if you can call them that, from the Guide to Pronunciation in the Penguin English Dictionary. It clearly shows you the complex relation in English between spelling and pronunciation. You have probably understood that the 7 words are these: enough, though, through, cough, bow, bought, and hiccup. Reading instruction has to ultimately render you able to recognize and distinguish words you may have heard people say that are written very differently, as you can see with these 7 examples, where each word has the 4 consecutive letters O, U, G, and H. Reading instruction begins with simple words and simple sounds. There are many sounds that are almost invariably written in the same way. Therefore, you can teach a child to see the written word ant as a, n, t, ant, or the written word end as e, n, d, end. Printed books for reading instruction emphasize these simple words at the start and gradually add more complex words where the sounds and the letters do not necessarily have a direct one-to-one relationship. The vowels in particular are often a source of complexity or ambiguity. The a, as in ant, for example, is represented on paper in exactly the same way as the a in amen. The e, as in end, is represented on paper in exactly the same way as the e in eel. It was to help the child gradually build up experience of the many ways that the same letters are used for different sounds that Maurice Ayley developed a scheme of guiding marks, though I believe that the most appropriate name for them is prompts. They prompt you to learn. His idea was to take any English text, for our purposes any published reading instruction book, and to add prompts to parts of words which were victims of ambiguity. He actually did it with a pencil. Here is a very simple demonstration of the use of Maurice Ayley prompts. Forgetting the realities of the functioning of a watering can, this is Janet. Learning to read this text, a good student would crawl across the page to give th, I, s, j, a, n, e, t, and then join the sounds to give this is Janet. Clearly, the th of this should be voiced as the, not th. The s of is should be said as z and not as s. The Ayley prompts, to bring you to this, I will link over the th and a line over the s. Then the student can see the, I, s, z, j, a, n, e, t, and then join the sounds to give this is Janet. The reading books from which I learned to read when I was 4 years old are marked in this way by my father. He would prepare a book in advance, and also, when he saw I had a difficulty with a word, he would add a prompt to show that the letter or letters in a certain word are representing a different sound to the most common use of the letter. Sometimes, across a double page of text, a difficult word is used several times. The prompt can be used for the first 2 occurrences, say, but not added subsequently, to test if the word has been correctly learned. In this scheme, the fundamental basis is learning the 43 sounds. 24 sounds of the 26 letters of the standard alphabet are used, but they are used for the sound that they give in their most frequent use. What I mean is that the vowel sounds are a, I, o, and a, not the way we would say them in reciting the alphabet, a, e, I, o, and u. However, as text on paper, those 24 letters might also represent other sounds. The letter O, for example, can be used to make 6 different sounds. The additional 19 sounds to make up the 43 might come from 1, 2, or 3 letters, or even in more complex ways. They are distinguished from the 24 simple sounds with a prompt. The Ayley prompts are an alert They alert you to the fact that letters can be treacherous and do not always represent a basic sound that you would normally associate with that letter. Little by little, you are coaxed by the prompts to expand your reading vocabulary. As misguided as it was, the Pitman system also used this route of 43 sounds. The basis for English reading instruction since 2013, 50 years later, does the same, although the more you nitpick on the precision of diction, the more likely you are to exceed 50 sounds. If you have the stamina, we can look more closely at Ayley prompts via the words with the OUGH complexity, never forgetting that the prompts are optional pencil marks added to correctly spelt printed texts. Starting with the word enough, the E as in eel is given a prompt to distinguish it from the common as in egg. In the Ayley approach, letters that produce no sound are silenced by underlining, so the non-contributing O is underlined. At the end of the word, the GH is combined to sound as F in fit, and the letters are given a prompt to alert you to this. This leaves you with E, N, A, F, read as enough, in its normal spelling, with prompts. The other words in our OUGH examples are prompted in a similar way. Though and through, just like bow and bought, differ by only one letter, but represent completely different sounds. The prompts guide you into learning the sounds that the text represents, always with its correct spelling. Hiccup, however, is a case apart, and there will be others. This special case probably doesn't worry Ayley prompts. The prompts are there to alert you to learn from experience, not to set you rules to follow. I propose that my father would have handwritten a P above the GH. Some of the research that I did led me to William Craigie, 1867 to 1957. He was a professional philologist, i.e., he lived for language. He wrote hundreds of books and was the third editor of the Oxford English Dictionary before going to Chicago, where he was Professor of English Literature. One 1922 book, titled English Reading Made Easy, introduces a system of marks to be added to normal spelling to alert the student to letters which do not have a predictable pronunciation. This is similar to the Maurice Ayley idea, so it is possible to speculate that my father knew about the Craigie marks. Nothing confirms this, and my father's ignorance of linguistics suggests he developed his idea entirely separately to Craigie. In perspective, for a man to do this on his own with no specialization in language is quite remarkable. Craigie's system began with text, however. It was not developed from sounds heard. His system didn't become commonplace either, even if he published several books, giving lesson after lesson for students to study. His approach was for rote learning, particularly for non-English students. There is a similarity between the Craigie and Pitman systems in that they both propose permanent changes to text that then have to be unlearned, and of course, specially printed books. It is this issue of publishing special books that the Maurice Ayley prompts bypass. The Pitman system, the initial teaching alphabet, with its separate fantastic symbols, not only requires special books, it separated the student from the outside world where normal text would be encountered. Parents could not help their children read unless they too had learned the Pitman system. The Maurice Ayley system is applied by an attentive teacher, adding temporary pencil prompts to any text. Once the child or student has grasped how the words that he has heard are represented on paper, the prompts are no longer required. Rather sadly, Only 3 people benefited from this ingenious approach, all able to read, write, and spell correctly before they went to school.